Okay, you guys, I have some questions on the next slide regarding Williams, and this sort of can guide your reading of the essay and potentially what we're talking through today. So, David Williams, South African context, right? We look to the end of the essay and we see that he's originally from the UK. He served as a missionary in South Africa, and he's currently a professor in South Africa, right? So at the very beginning of his essay, he is presenting a juxtaposition between a Western European perspective on Genesis 1-3 and an African perspective on it, right? And so the way that he sets this binary up, or this contrast, is that he says Europe and its offsprings in other parts of the world have had a tradition of treating Genesis 1-3 as literally true and a historical account of primal events, right? And this is after the scientific revolution. The Bible began to be interpreted as literally true. And prior to that, interestingly, these stories were not read as literal. What he then goes on to say is that African Christians, however, right, and this is the comparison, so we know what he's going to be doing. He's going to be comparing sort of the Western European perspective on this to an African perspective, and really focusing on an African perspective. They're much less likely than those in the United States and other places to accept a literal explanation of Genesis. Then he says, here are the reasons. Africa has a far shorter history of writing. It's an oral culture, and therefore much less respect for the authority of the written word, right? It's not as authoritative. Second, whereas European religious literary history did have a variety of stories to explain the origin of the world, these have long since generally been forgotten, primarily because they were, or partly because they were regarded as just stories. In contrast, while the old stories of origins in Africa explaining such things as why palms of black people are not pigmented may not be believed, they're still widely known. They're very familiar and popular. The natural reaction for African Christians then is just to treat Genesis in the same way as a white myth. Indeed, the Bible itself is still commonly regarded as a white book, so it's not really a part of Africa. Africans have their own creation stories, have their own etiologies and explanations for things, and the Bible only came to Africa belatedly and through colonization, right? And colonization had devastating effects for Africa, as much as white missionaries may have believed that they were bringing God and civilized life. African countries already had their own ways of being, knowing, thinking, relating, their own culture, right? Africa, he goes on to say, so now we're thinking about, he's got us thinking about the world in front of the text, right? Who is reading this Bible? Africa is pervaded by spirituality. Indeed, Africa tends to be much more religious than the modern West, but this spirituality is not in relation to God, he says. This is another reason it's difficult to identify with the creation stories in Genesis. It's common in Africa to stress that the separation of God from the world rather than a connection between the two. It's so strong that many early missionaries couldn't understand this as a belief in God, because God was a more transcendent, clearly transcendent, he writes. In Africa, people do not relate to God directly. They interact with the dead and with their ancestors, and then through their mediation is contact with God possible. It is in this belief that African spirituality resides. The absence of crucial elements from the Genesis stories contributes to its lack of relevance then for many Africans, right? And traditionally then missionaries have seen these as issues, right? What we are being challenged to see through this lens is that rather than these being problems, they're merely cultural differences, right? And not an issue, because again, Africans already have their own concept of spirituality, of God, in relation to community. So let's talk about that, right? Interaction with the ancestors, for instance, is part of a view of humanity which complements the belief in the absence of God. Interpersonal relationships are more important necessarily than direct individual relationship with God. In contrast to the excessive individualism in the West, right? In the West, there's more of a focus on the individual connecting with God or on individual development. there is in Africa communitarianism, right? So we have this contrast between radical individualism in the West and then communitarian thinking in Africa, right? It's about all of us, not just one of us, right? The same is true for salvation. We'll get to that in a second. So this also makes Genesis stories not very meaningful for them. The example that he gives is individual responsibility and individual guilt just don't relate to them. In a culture where the emphasis is on the community, there's really little sense of personal guilt. Therefore, there's little sense of a need for individual salvation. So then he wants to say there are ways in which the African context does connect with Genesis 1-3. First, the phrase, these are the generations, right? Definitely would connect with a group of people that sees themselves in terms of their ancestors. More important is the story of the fall indicates the effect of sin, not just on the individual, but on the group, right? Here, the unity of humanity is significant in an Africa that has felt the brunt of particularly racism, where people have sometimes been treated as subhuman. Furthermore, the African emphasis on community finds a point of contact with Genesis in that humans are created in the image of God, right? This would definitely be, this would resonate with an African worldview. Here are the ways then that the text does not resonate. That there is a single couple, one man and one woman, and that the biblical story of the riches of community does not extend beyond this model of monogamy. In African culture, the extended family is much more important. And we might argue that if the God-given monogamy of Genesis, he says, here's the critique, were practiced more diligently in Africa, this may have influenced HIV and AIDS in the world. He says, the story of the fall is a reminder that the ideal for human behavior is not humanity, but God's norms, right? The one thing that comes over so strongly in the story of the fall is that there are norms set by God, and disobedience to them has serious consequences. So here's the conclusion. The end of that third full paragraph down. An African reading of Genesis 1-3 and of Scripture in general brings greater appreciation of human community, an emphasis that is tended to be overshadowed elsewhere. And this is where he ends up, right, is the focus on human community. This also makes a valuable contribution to key questions concerning the nature of humanity and how humans should behave toward each other. He says this fits beautifully with this unique African concept of Ubuntu, which is literally translated as humanity. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was really influential in work after apartheid. Archbishop Desmond Tutu explained Ubuntu in this way in his book, No Future Without Forgiveness. A person with Ubuntu is open and available to others, affirming of others, does not feel threatened that others are able and good, for he or she has a proper self-assurance that comes from knowing that he or she belongs in a greater whole and is diminished when others are humiliated or diminished, and when others are tortured or oppressed. There's no doubt that the world stands in great need of this ethic as long as it is seen in the context of Genesis, in which Genesis puts it as something given through God and in relation to God, right? So really thinking about the ways in which this is what Williams is challenging us to do, thinking about the ways in which we in the West could learn from this African concept of Ubuntu, right? That when others are humiliated or diminished, I, too, am humiliated and diminished, right? Our entire society is connected. Things to think about. Which begs the question, right, in light of some things that have happened recently. I'm thinking about what's happened and is happening in contemporary Palestine. I'm also thinking about what's happened in terms of the Black lives recently that have been taken, people who have been murdered, right? What happens when we think about people who are suffering, right, as being connected to us? What if those were, and sometimes they are, our family members, right? What is our responsibility, and how would that change the way that we engage that information and the way that we engage those individuals if we thought about them in terms instead in terms of being connected to us in larger society. I think it definitely would make us much more compassionate. It's a good challenge for Williams and for me.